This morning I'm going to read you a story. I find children's books are a wonderful way to highlight some very important concepts. Yep. And I'm a teacher librarian. This story shows me how thanks can be the only word that is needed. So, Dogger, Shirley Hughes. Many of you will know this one. I'm going to stand here, try and use the microphone, and if you can see the pictures, excellent. Do you want to move? It's good. Sorry. Dogger. Once there was a soft brown toy called Dogger. One of his ears pointed upward and the other flopped over. His fur was worn in places because he was quite old. He belonged to Dave. Dave was very fond of Dogger. He took him everywhere. Sometimes he gave him rides in a trolley. Sometimes he pulled him along on a lead made of string like a real dog. When it was cold, he wrapped him up in a bit of blanket. Now and again, Dave's mum said that Dogger was getting much too dirty, and she showed Dave how to wash him in a bowl of soapy water. Then they hung him up by his tail on a washing line to dry. Dave's baby brother Joe liked hard toys. He liked putting them in his mouth and biting on them because he was getting teeth. Dave's big sister Bella took 7 teddies to bed every night. She had to sleep right up against the wall to stop herself from falling out. But Dave only liked Dogger. One afternoon, Dave and Mum set out to collect Bella from school. Mum took Joe in the pushchair and Dave took Dogger. Next to the school gate, where the mums waited, was a playing field. Some men with ladders were putting up coloured flags. Mum said they were going to have a summer fair to get money to buy things for the school. Dave pushed Dogger up against the railing to show him what was going on. Just then, the children started to come out of school. An ice cream van came round the corner playing a tune. Bella ran up with her satchel flying. "Mum, can we have an ice cream?" Mum gave her money for 2 cones. Joe didn't have a whole ice cream to himself because he was too dribbly. On the way home, Dave walked beside the pushchair, giving Joe licks off his ice cream. Joe kicked his feet about and shouted for more in-between licks. At tea time, Dave was rather quiet. In the bath, he was even quieter. At bedtime, he said, "I want Dogger." But Dogger was nowhere to be found. Mum looked under the bed. She looked behind the cupboard. She searched in the kitchen and underneath the stairs. Dave watched anxiously through the banisters. Joe watched through the bars of his cot. Bella joined in to look for Dogger. She turned out her own toy box in case he was there, but he wasn't. When Dad came home, he looked for Dogger too. He searched in the shed and down the garden path with a torch, but Dogger was quite lost. Dave was very sad when he went to bed. Bella kindly lent him one of her teddies to go to sleep with, but he wasn't the same thing as Dogger. Dave kept waking up in the night and missing him. The next day was that day, and they all went to the school summer fair. The playing field was full of stalls and sideshows. There was a fancy dress parade. There were sports with an egg and spoon race, a wheelbarrow race, and a father's race. Bella was very good at races. She won the 3-legged race with her friend Barbara. "Wouldn't you like to go in for a race?" they asked Dave. But Dave didn't feel like racing. He was missing Dogger too much. Then, another very exciting thing happened to Bella. She won first prize in a raffle. It was a huge yellow teddy bear wearing a beautiful blue silk bow. He was almost as big as Dave. Dave didn't like that teddy at all at that moment. He didn't like Bella much either because she kept winning things. he went off on his own to look at the stalls. I seem to have my people around me. Okay. One lady had a toy stall full of knitted ducks and cars and baby dolls in bonnets. And there, at the very back, behind a lot of other toys, was Dogger. He was wearing a sign saying 5p. It's some money from somewhere, I'm not sure. There were a lot of people round the stall. Dave tried to explain to the lady that it was his dogger who got lost and been put on the stall by mistake. But she wasn't listening. He looked in his pocket, but he only had 3p. It wasn't enough. He ran to find Mum and Dad and to get them to buy Dogger back at once. Dave went everywhere in the crowd, but he couldn't see Mum and Dad. He thought he was going to cry. At last he found Bella by the cakes. When she heard about Dogger, she and Dave ran back to the toy store as fast as they could, but something terrible had happened. Dogger had just been bought by a little girl. She was already walking off with him. Dave began to cry. Bella ran after her and tried to explain that Dogger really belonged to Dave, and could they please buy him back? But the little girl said no. She said she bought Dogger with her own money and she wanted him. She held on to him very tightly. Dave cried and cried, and the little girl started to cry too. But out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of Bella's big yellow teddy. She stopped crying and put out her hand to stroke his beautiful blue silk bow. Then Bella did something very kind. "Would you swap this teddy for my brother's dog then?" she asked. Right away, the little girl stopped crying and began to smile. She held out Dogger to Dave, took the big yellow teddy instead, and went off with him in her arms. Then Dave smiled too. He hugged Dogger and he hugged Bella round the waist. "Thank you, Bella," he said. That night, Dave had Dogger in bed beside him. Bella was practicing somersaults. "Will you miss that big teddy?" Dave asked her. "No," said Bella. "I didn't like him much. He was too big and his eyes were too staring. Anyway, if I had another teddy in my bed, there wouldn't be room for me." Yes, thanks. We need to give thanks. Did you notice Bella's contentment, that counter-cultural idea of having enough? Thanksgiving and contentment push up against the want of the world we live in. In today's reading, we find David the king calling the people to offer thanks to God. He wants joyful noise, he wants songs of praise, he wants worship. Why would David call his people to do this, and what can we learn from David? Why is the prayer of thanksgiving the act we need? Dave had much to thank God for, even from the very beginning. He was the youngest of 8 brothers to his father Jesse, and David was working as a shepherd. The prophet Samuel anointed him as future king while Saul was still king and David was still young. Who'd have thought that would happen? David had much to thank God for even at this stage. He was chosen to play the harp for Saul. I've always wondered at the wisdom of this because David's presence just seems to irritate Saul. Anyway, killing Goliath just made things worse with Saul. Usually, when you angered an ancient king, you were done for. David survives. Another reason to thank God. His soldiering was so successful, and he was made king of Judah and then king of all Israel. David knows that God has been with him again. David brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and makes his kingdom strong. The people of the ancient world were familiar with the cost of war, and David knew that God was the one to thank. But probably the incident that might have surprised David was that he was still beloved of God after he had had sex with Bathsheba. She would not have been able to say no. And then he arranged to have her husband Uriah killed. For this terrible act there was death, but God did not desert David. David's thanks to God is heartfelt, and he encourages his people to follow his example. Good stuff. We can see here that although David was a sinner, and he knew it, he remembered God and acknowledged all that God had done for him. What of us? We make our own world. We make plans, carry them out. We are self-made people. It's really up to us. Simply be more organised, be more focused, and that's it. Well, maybe. But when people forget to give thanks, it sets people on into an individual whirlwind. Without thanking God, we miss out on so much. We miss out because we make ourselves too big. If we think we have made our lives and that there is no one to thank but ourselves, how do we stop our ego inflating like a huge balloon? We make ourselves foolish and become braggarts, not pleasant company. And what happens when that huge balloon of ego bursts? We fall. We can fall and keep falling. We need to shift our focus from what we have achieved to what we have received. Recognising that we are not completely self-sufficient and remembering God and all that God has done for us is the answer. Seeing the beauty of the earth and sky, seeing the wonder of our family and friends, learning about our faith gives a refreshed outlook, and thanking God for all this is the start of contentment. Last week we heard Dave talk about adoration. Our adoration of God for who God is. Thanksgiving is thanking God for what we have received from God. I can speak of times when I found thanking God came soaring straight from my heart. I've preached a few times now and was keen to learn how, but during the course I remember many times putting my head on the desk upstairs and feeling certain that I would never be able to do it. When I did preach for the first time and sat down at the end, I felt the words, "Thank you," surging up from my heart. I thank God for the opportunity and for being enabled to do it. Last year, when Mickey, my daughter, took me on a holiday to Japan, I packed this cross I'd been given when I was confirmed. A while into the trip, I wanted to hold the cross, but I couldn't find it. I quietly looked for a while, and then, feeling sad, I gave up, thinking it was lost. I told Mick, my daughter, because I knew my mood would dampen our day, and she'd suggested another look, and yes, there it was, in a very safe spot. What thought came from my heart? Thank you. Sitting with a group of friends having coffee, coming home tired after another big day, seeing the plants on my veranda flower, laughing with my students when we share a funny book. I've got to say, thank you comes to my mind over and over. By thanking and praising God, we can change our perspective from what we lack to what we have. We notice our everyday blessings and reduce that thief of joy comparison. By giving God thanks, we can build a more hopeful outlook on life. Giving thanks to God is central to our faith. We find the joy and the peace that God gives us, and we acknowledge that God is the source of goodness in our lives. We thank God individually for the myriad of times we remember what God has given us. We thank God as a community here at Luck when we sing the doxology and when we give thanks together during our prayers for the people. Giving thanks together, like the gratitude we felt last week when Radhika spoke of Paige and Rail's wedding, is part of our community joy. When we pray a prayer of thanks, we remember that God is God and we are human. What a relief. I will acknowledge that God has given me and not take it all for granted. For God all around, I thank you.